بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين وبعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you all, and welcome for joining us on this third lesson of Tajweed Made Easy. As we start this lesson, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to learn what will benefit us and to benefit us with what we learn and to increase us with knowledge, inshallah ta'ala. As we have said, this is the third lesson of our 8-week course, which we are delivering online. If you are just joining us for today for the first time, you can view the previous lessons online on YouTube, and especially if you need to catch up with anything that you may have missed, those are a good asset and a set of material for you to go through if needed. Just before we start, we'll have the same reminder as previously that we're starting with the name and praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again to reset our intentions of why we are here, why we are learning, and inshallah if we can be in a state of wudu, that would be preferable for all. Today, as I said, it's our third lesson, so we are referring to things that we've seen in a couple of lessons previous. So again, if you need to refer back to those lessons, it would be ideal just so that things are matched together. And again, in the weeks subsequent to today, we will be referring back to things previous. So it's always good to be in the habit of going through things which we've done already. Firstly, just to cement the knowledge, and secondly, to get us ready for anything new that we might be doing. So as with always, we've been starting with a little reminder before we start our lesson, and we've been starting with a few hadith, a few sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We started in our first week with the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, where we talked about the two types of people who will come and start their journey or continue their journey with the Quran. And then last week, as we were going through the letters of the Arabic alphabet and the letters of the Quran, we talked through the hadith which talked about the benefit and the blessing of every single letter which we have in the Quran, so linking into the lesson which we were going through. Today's lesson, as we'll see, is on the characteristics and ways of describing letters and ways of grouping them together. So to be able to link into that, the hadith which we've chosen today is one which hopefully should link into that theme a lot more for us. So we'll go through the hadith and just talk through things which we can take from it and can benefit from it, and then inshallah ta'ala start with today's lesson. It's quite a long hadith compared to the couple that we've seen previously. So we'll only go through the hadith once, both in Arabic and in English. But obviously it's there for you if you want to refer to in the future. So this is a hadith related by Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, in which he says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, مثل المؤمن الذي يقرأ القرآن كمثل الأترجة ريحها طيب وطعمها طيب ومثل المؤمن الذي لا يقرأ القرآن كمثل التمرة لا ريح لها وطعمها حلو ومثل المنافق الذي يقرأ القرآن مثل الريحانة ريحها طيب وطعمها مر ومثل المنافق الذي لا يقرأ القرآن كمثل الحنظلة ليس لها ريح وطعمها مر. So as we said, this hadith narrated by Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, who said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the likeness of a believer who recites the Quran is that of a citron, the taste and smell of which are good. The likeness of the believer who does not read the Quran is that of a date, the taste of which is good, but it has no smell. The likeness of a hypocrite who reads the Quran is that of sweet basil, the smell of which is good, but its taste is bitter. And the likeness of a hypocrite who does not read the Quran is that of a colocynth or bitter apple, the taste of which is bitter and it has no smell. Okay, so a relatively long hadith here which we've got, and a very descriptive hadith in which we're given 4 different categories of people. And I guess depending on how you want to link them together, you could either link them together in the 2 that read the Quran, the first and the third paragraphs here, or you can link them together in whether they're talking about, whether the hadith is talking about a person of belief or a hypocrite. So there's two different ways of kind of sectioning things out. And inshallah, we'll just go through this hadith and just take a few lessons from it, inshallah, to help us with our understanding. So the first thing to say is linking to a hadith Qudusi, a saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala narrated through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I have got ready or prepared for my believing servants, talking about Jannah, talking about paradise, ما لا عين رأت ولا أذن سمعت ولا خطر على قلب بشر. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when talking about Jannah, I have prepared things which no eye has seen, no ear has heard of, and no heart of a person, no essence of a person can even contemplate or understand. So in this hadith Qudusi, we're being told that Jannah or paradise is such a thing that despite us striving for it, it's so immense that we are unable to compute and unable to realize how good it is. But saying that, in the Quran and the Hadith, we are given examples of what Jannah is going to be like. Whether it's talking about the description of the palaces or the trees or the rivers, we're given descriptions of what Jannah is like. So you've got kind of a distinction here. Despite it being so above our intellect, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still gives us examples that our kind of very finite minds, very constricted minds can relate to. And that is an allowance for us to spur us on to strive for Jannah. And I think if we take that mindset and relate it to this hadith, we've got something like the Quran, something which its benefits cannot even be magnituded, cannot even be contemplated because they're so high. Yet we're given examples here that are easily relatable for us so that we can understand exactly what we will gain by building on our relationship with the Quran. So I think that's the first thing to take from it. It sounds like a very strange connection or something that we're not used to seeing, or maybe a lot of us have not heard of this hadith before, but that's the kind of mindset that we can come into it, in that, yes, we know the Quran is this heavenly book that we're trying to connect to, but we're being given some very day-to-day examples of things that we can connect to the Quran to try and improve our understanding. Okay, so that's the first thing to note. If we go through and kind of just talk about the four fruits, vegetables, and herbs which are mentioned in this hadith, you can kind of see a leveling as we go from top to bottom. So we start with the citron, and the citron is described and categorized as one which is similar to an orange, but also similar to a lemon. And it's actually a hybrid between the two. So a hybrid between an orange and a lemon. And this fruit is still with us to today. And it's a fruit in Syria known as gabbad, which is actually a hybrid of the two. But for us, we can call it just a general citrus fruit. What do we know of citrus fruits? We know that they have health benefits, they have vitamins, and not only are they used for, say, perfume, but they're also used in medicine and also used in cooking. So various things in our lives use this essence to kind of bring out flavor, to bring out smell, and no part of it brings the characteristics or the level of anything down. It's only used to enhance things. So that's what we can mention about the citron. Then we go on to the date. We're all very we're all very aware of what a date is because of our relation to the hadith and breaking our fast with dates. If we think about a date, what it's saying here in that it has no smell, I think we all could realize that, but now I think we're more aware of it. And it's only actually when you eat the date that that intense sweetness comes through. So yes, in and of itself, it's good, but it doesn't have any smell. And it's only when we eat it that we get some goodness from it. Third one, the basil. Again, it's known as a very common herb. One that which when we smell, or if you were to pass where it's growing, you could definitely smell what the herb is. But if you were to eat it, as it says here with the taste, it is a bitter taste. And the only way to taste that, to change that from being bitter, the only way to change that from being bitter is to mix it with something else. So you've got this idea that it is what it is, as in a herb, but you can't eat it straight, and it needs to be either affected by what's around it or changed in some way that can make it palatable. And then you have the last one, which is the bitter apple, sometimes kind of referred to as a gourd, something very bitter. And compared to the basil, there's no real way of changing it. There's no smell to it. When you eat it, even if you cook it, there's no way of changing it, and it remains in its bitter state. So that's just kind of some explanation of the four likelytudes and similitudes which were given here in this hadith. So we take a step back again and we look at this hadith, and it mentions two distinctions between how we're going to connect with the Quran and how we're connecting with these four items. And it talks about the taste and the smell of both. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he said that the ta'am, as in the taste, which is referred to here, is actually the iman, your faith, and your proclamation of faith. And you can see the reasoning of that here is that whenever it talks about the believer, there's a positive attribute connected to the taste, whether it's tayyib or hulm, whether it's good or sweet, there's a positivity related to that. So Ibn Hajar says that the ta'am is something which means your iman, your faith, and specifically proclaiming your faith. Whereas the rih, the smell which is talked about, it's only talked about when a person is reciting the Quran. So this breath or this smell actually is related to the tilawa, as in the reciting of the Quran. And that's why you have this kind of imagery of a smell coming out, and especially when one is reciting the Quran, that smell that is coming out in and of itself is sweet and palatable. Okay, so those are some background things to mention. So the question is, what can we take from this hadith? What are kind of a few lessons that we can take from this hadith that we can start enacting and just to increase our understanding? I think there's three main things to take from this hadith for today. The first one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that we will show them examples or ayat or signs in themselves and on the horizons, as in within the world, that they will be able to look upon to. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ, until it becomes apparent to them that this is the truth. So all of these things which are here as signs are for us to recognize the truth of Islam, the truth of our iman, and the truth of our purpose. So we've got here four examples of very day-to-day things. And I think one thing that we can take from it is whenever we see any of these four things now in the future, hopefully, it's not going to just be a date that we see or a basil that we'll see when we see a herb bush, but it's actually going to remind us of this hadith. And it's actually going to remind us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's going to remind us of the Quran. And the more reminders that we can have, the stronger our connection will be. So separate from this, the more connections that we can make, the better. But specifically with this hadith, I think that's the first thing that we can take from it. Sometimes even very mundane day-to-day things, which we kind of use and utilize without any thinking, they actually can be a part of our faith and a part of our reconnecting with the Quran and our reconnecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah says, we will show them our signs within themselves and on the horizons with those things around them. And I think this is one key thing to take from that. The second thing that I think is very interesting is the imagery which is given with regards to these four items. If we talk about the citron, what are we talking about? We're talking about a tree which bears fruit. And afterwards you can look up, or you can think about trees which you may have seen citrus fruit-like, the trunks of which are very strong because they have to take up a lot of water because they're normally in quite hot climates. The leaves are vibrant green, And the fruit that they are giving are again vibrant in color, whether that's an orange or a yellow color. So you have this very tall, very strong tree, very vibrant in color, giving fruits, and not just giving kind of small fruits, giving big fruits, and not just fruits in and of itself, but fruits that provide health and medicine and taste and perfume benefits. So you've got this imagery of this kind of big, strong tree there. But then when we go down to the second one of a date, it's still a tall tree, a date palm, but when we think about the color of it, it's not as vibrant. It's kind of a little bit dulled down. And yes, the fruits are there, but they're kind of bunched up towards the top. So you've not got kind of that abundant feeling. Yes, the fruits are there, but it's kind of all bunched together towards the top of that tree. And yes, it's tall, but it's not as vibrant as the first. So we're kind of starting with a tall, very strong citrus tree, and then we're kind of going down to a date palm, not as vibrant, but still bearing fruit. And then you can probably follow with myself as we're going through it. You've got then a herb, and we know that a herb doesn't grow to a tall height. It grows to kind of at most waist height, or normally a lot lower. And yes, it smells good, but you don't have that height. If we're talking about imagery now, you don't have that height as it compares to the first two. And then moving along, we have the bitter apple, the colocynth or the gourd. It actually grows along the floor, along the soil. So height-wise, there's absolutely no height to it, and it's as close to the ground as it could be. And I think imagery-wise, it's really interesting that these four things have been chosen here as an example for us, because in striving for the best, you're actually being given something which is a lot higher up. And then as the levels go down, the actual imagery of the height of what is being talked about also goes down. And again, it links into the ayah of Surah Ibrahim, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a similitude of a good word. And it's talked about a good word being a tree whose roots and foundations are strong and solid within the earth. But not only that, the branches of that tree rise up towards the sky. And not only do the branches rise up towards the sky, but the fruits come from the tree, and not just the fruits 1 year, but they come every year. The example which is given about a good word, and a good word we could link in here to the Quran. So we've got this linking of imagery. So the strength that comes from a tree having good sustenance is the same sustenance and the same growth that we can have in our connection to the Quran. And on the flip side, it's talked about a bad word or a harsh word is one which is kind of plucked from the earth, and it has no kind of power of within itself. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُثَبِّتُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْقَوْلِ الثَّابِتِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala strengthens the believer with a strong word, as in meaning the Quran, in linking them to this kind of height increase, this kind of strength, this imagery which is given of this kind of immense tree with strong roots and tall branches and giving fruit. And we inshallah ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of people who are connected to this strong word. Okay, so that's the second thing which we can take from this hadith, this imagery which we're given here throughout the hadith. If we actually go back to the hadith itself, as we said, there's two distinctions, and we've talked about the distinctions between the rih and the ta'am, the smell and the taste, about being iman and the reciting of the Quran. We've talked about the difference between the four items which are given here. But the last way in which this hadith differentiates between is the mu'min and the munafiq. So we know that a mu'min is a believer, somebody who reads the Quran, who embodies the Quran, and it's not done as a show to themselves or to others, but it's actually a conscious and solemn effort in which there's no pride and there's no kind of other worldly gain associated with that. It's true and it's natural from within themselves. And on the flip side, you have the munafiq, somebody who may well do good things, but that doesn't really penetrate into the heart. And maybe lip service will be given, whether it's reciting the Quran or perceiving or acting as a Muslim or acting as a believer, acting as a mu'min, but the effects of it are very superficial and they don't penetrate any deeper. So the last thing that we can take from the hadith is a sort of in and out connection with the Quran. If we want the Quran to be something which we embody, if we want to become that walking and talking Quran, like the Prophet ﷺ was described, then we need to be those who actually allow the Quran to embody us. So it's not just lip service, it's not just reciting for the sake of reciting, it's not just reciting without understanding, it's not just reciting in front of others, but we have this deep personal kind of experience, or this deep personal journey which we're on, where we're trying to and endeavoring as much as we can to connect with the Quran, to build that relationship with the Quran. So it's not just an outward proclamation of faith, which doesn't resonate within ourselves, but there's this in and out connection. So it's affecting us inside, but it's also affecting our actions as well. And I think that links into the ta'am and the rih as well that we talked about. So the ta'am, the taste of what's being talked about, is kind of what you have and you kind of keep within yourself as the taste, as the iman, as the faith. And that's something which only you know about, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how strong that is. Whereas with the rih, the tilawa, something which can actually beautify that iman, you're having that imagery here of kind of something coming from the inside out towards somebody else, with the perfume of reciting the Quran. And not only does it perfume yourself and those around you, but it can also perfume your household. We know an example of this in that the Prophet ﷺ said that the shaitan does not enter a house in which Surah Al-Baqarah is recited. So you can see this rih, this perfume, this smell which is coming out, which is personified here as tilawa, as a recitation of the Quran, can actually have these kind of widespread effects on ourselves and those around us. So the three things again, using examples that we've got of things around us to remind us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Quran, the imagery of something strong and resilient with our connection with the Quran, and then making sure our connection with the Quran is not superficial and it actually penetrates to our insides, and in doing so affects our actions and then those around us. So a very interesting hadith, and I hope that you've enjoyed reading about it and continuing our understanding of it. So it's not one that we hear about too often, mainly potentially because of its length or otherwise, but the real reason why we've gone through this hadith is because it's talking about characteristics or ways of describing things, and subhanallah, that's what our lesson is about today. So without further ado, bismillah, alhamdulillah, we'll start with our lesson for today. So in the last couple of lessons, we've been going through we had kind of an introduction where we talked about what the Quran is, what tartil is, and why we're here, why we're wanting to start this course, which has been named Tajweed Made Easy. And then last lesson, we talked about the letters, the origins of the letters. We bunched them up into 5 main points of origin. And we talked through all of the different 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet. And we said that they all have specific characteristics. And that is, inshallah ta'ala, what we're going to be seeing today. So again, there are workbooks and kind of modules which are able to be printed off by yourselves. So either if you have them ready, then get them to hand. If not, then you can just write things down on a piece of paper and then fill in the notes at a later date. So if we just start with a bit of terminology before we start, we talked about origins of letters last week. And if I just ask you to use the chat box, can anyone remember how we say origins of letters in Arabic from last week? Perfect. I should remember that. I have to give you time before we lose hope. But alhamdulillah, those have come through very well. So we had the verb kharaja, which meant to exit, and then that got formed into a place called makhraj, which was singular, and then that got turned into plural, makharij. But if we take the word letters, how do we translate that into Arabic? So how do you say letters in Arabic? Perfect. So harf is singular and huruf, as is being said here in the chat box, is plural. So last week we had makharij, origins, makharijul huruf, al-huruf meaning letters. So you can see here in the lesson today, we do have the word letters again. So we're going to have the word huruf here, but it's not makharij. This time we're doing characteristics. So we'll just need to learn how to say the word characteristics. So we probably know the word which will come up now, the word sifa. The word sifa, it's quite a common word, and the word sifa means characteristics. We've not started from a verb level this week, we've gone straight into the noun. Quite simply, the word sifa means characteristic and it is a singular, and then to change that to a plural, you simply add an extra alif or an extra a, and it goes from sifa to sifat, sifat, and has that elongation there. So here we've got our word characteristics. So if we wanted to say characteristics of the letters, which two words are we going to bring together? Can anyone write it in the chat box? Perfect. So sifatul huruf. So we've got the word sifat, which means characteristics, al-huruf, which means letters, characteristics of letters, sifatul huruf. Excellent. So that is the topic for today. Today we're going to be covering 6 characteristics. This is not an exhaustive list. There are more characteristics like apparent or within theory that can be covered, but these are the main 6 and the ones which we're most able to enact to improve our recitation, and that's why these 6 have been chosen. As we said with last week when we were going through our makharij al-huruf, our origins, we said that certain letters had a certain way that they were pronounced because of the origin that they came from. So it's very easy to say that some of these characteristics are quite natural to those letters, and we don't actually have to do anything extra to allow that characteristic to come through. The reason for knowing these characteristics is firstly so that all of these similar letters can be bunched together. So we have certain categories of letter, all of which have the same characteristic. The second reason why we want to go through characteristics is that if there is a characteristic there and we want to put it in action, we don't only want to put it in action, but we want to strengthen it as much as we can. So it's not just putting a characteristic into action, whether natural or otherwise, it's about strengthening that as much as we can. Again, it's getting from that basic level to perfection. So we're wanting to try and increase on whatever we have. Okay, so these are our 6 sifat, our 6 characteristics that inshallah we will be seeing today. So bismillah, we'll start with number 1. Number 1 is called al-hams. Al-hams. We have an example of the word al-hams or the word hams in Surah Taha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَخَشَعَتِ الْأَصْوَاتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ فَلَا تَسْمَعُ إِلَّا هَمْسًا. Talking about the day of Qiyamah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the voices will be humbled and quietened in front of Allah, in front of Ar-Rahman, so that you won't even be able to hear, or all that you'll be able to hear is a breath or a very kind of small inconspicuous sound. So that is how al-hams is described. It's described as actual breath. And again, taking it from linguistically to an explanative meaning, al-hams is described as a release of breath during recitation. A release of breath during recitation. خروج النفس عند النطق. Okay. So we talked about our sound coming out when we talked about the origins of the letters last week, and we said that our sound starts from the bottom, from our voice box, and depending on where our makhraj, our origin of our letter is, our anatomy moves around to be able to allow that sound to come out correctly. So if we're talking about sound, what are we talking about? We're saying that something comes out from the inside and there needs to be an opening for that sound to be able to come out, or for that breath to be able to come out. And that's exactly what the scholars have mentioned, that these letters of al-hams have a natural opening of the vocal cords to allow this breath to come out. So obviously the flip side would be a closing of the throat or a closing of the vocal cords to stop the breath, but with this we have an opening to allow the breath to come through. Of the 28 letters, it relates to 10 letters of the alphabet. Okay, so obviously only those 10 letters have this characteristic, the rest have the opposite, which we're not covering now for completeness, but there is kind of that corresponding opposite characteristic for reference. So if we're saying some letters have a release of breath during recitation, how are we going to be able to gauge that? Simply by putting your hand in front of your mouth when you're saying a letter and seeing if that letter, if you can feel the breath coming out with that letter. So I'll choose probably the most obvious one is the letter ha, which we said came from the middle of the throat. Ha. If you all say the letter ha and you put your hand in front of your mouth, you can feel the breath coming out. And that's what's described here as a release of breath during recitation. You say ha, ha, ha. You can feel that warmth and even that physical movement on your hand. And that is the release of breath that we're talking about. So 9 other letters now for us to consider. Do we want to, in the chat box, go through which letters we think those are, the remaining 9? Which letters, when reciting them, have this expulsion, this release of breath? If we were to put our hand in front, we'd feel that movement or that warmth coming through from the breath. Perfect. So a lot of correct examples here. So I think we're all probably going through the alphabet ba, da, tha, jim, ha, kha, and feeling which ones have that expulsion of breath. Excellent. So I think we've got the idea here because most of them, if not all, are correct. So as I said, it relates to 10 letters of the alphabet, and these are the 10 letters here which it relates to. So we've got the letter fa, ha, tha, ha, shin, kha, sad, sin, kaf, and da. So again, if we want to put a fatha on all of these, what would we say? Fa, ha, tha, ha, sha, kha, sa, sa, ka, and da. Okay. So 10 letters here, which are categorized as letters of al-hams. And all of these letters have this release of breath during recitation. For the majority of them, it will come quite naturally. As we said, with the ha, you've got this connection, this origin of the middle of the throat, and there's no way of reciting that letter without this characteristic coming through. You've got the letter shin. You've got a connection or a movement of the middle of the tongue towards the top of the mouth, and there's no way of reciting this letter without that characteristic coming through. So in the majority of these, the characteristic is quite natural, and there's not really anything that we need to do differently. We'll just move on to the whiteboard now. Hopefully everybody has written those 10 letters down, and if not, you can refer to it a bit later. We'll just talk through some notes as an aside. Okay, so when going through the examples there, we took each of those letters and we put a fatha on them. And you could have done the same with a kasra or a dhamma, but for example's sake, we chose a fatha to talk them through. So if we're going to take the letter fa and we put a fatha on it, and then if we have another example where we've actually got a hamza before, which has the fatha on, and the fa itself has a sukoon on. Let's just recite those two first. I'll go back to the slides in a second, inshallah. If we recite those two first, we've got a letter with just a vowel on and one of these letters with a fatha before it, and we say f, 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 f. And I'd encourage you all to try these examples so that we can answer the question that comes in a second. So we've got the letter f, f, and again, you can use your hand to feel the amount of breath that's coming out. And we've got the sound f, f. Question is there more hums when the letter is just voweled or when the letter is sakina? Is there more hums when the letter is just voweled or when the letter is sakina? What do you think, from feeling the breath or just from how it sounds? Perfect. So I think that's quite conclusive. Everybody said and experienced for themselves that when a letter of these 10 of al-hams is sakina, it has more hums, or the characteristic of al-hams can be enacted more because you've actually got this closing onto the letter. When it's just a vowel, you just recite the vowel and you'll more than likely move on to another letter. Whereas with when it is sakina, it's closed off because it connects to what's before it. So you have that opportunity to kind of linger on that letter, and that will allow the characteristic of al-hams to be increased. So that's the first side note to say. When a letter of al-hams has a sakina on, it is the characteristic of al-hams is increased. So we have the word which we'll all be aware of. Is the word afwaja from the surah, Surah An-Nasr. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. So we've got an example here of a word which has a letter of al-hams. It's not only voweled, but it actually has a sukoon on. So this characteristic of al-hams is going to be increased. So we'll say فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أف. And you can hear that expulsion and you can feel it if you were to put your hand there. Afwaja. So it's just going to the origin and taking what would be there anyway and just increasing its strength to allow this characteristic of al-hams. So we'll see another example, the word ahsana. So again, similar example, we've got one of the letters of al-hams, it has a sukoon, so we're going to increase this characteristic. Again, with ha, it's quite natural for that to happen anyway, but being aware of these characteristics will allow us to increase it in the given example. So we'll say ahsana, and you'll really feel this breath holding on that letter and feel the expulsion or the release of that breath as it's being recited. Okay, so quite a simple characteristic to go through. And we've said that with this characteristic of al-hams, which is a release of breath during recitation, there is a release of breath. If the letter has a sukoon on, it's increased compared to when it's voweled. And it's quite a natural characteristic to come through, but being aware of it allows it to be increased and strengthened as much as possible. Okay, so we've said the letters at the beginning, fa, ha, tha, all of those were quite common or understandable letters that would have this characteristic of al-hams. But the last letter which we covered was the letter da, which comes from the tip of the tongue, as we mentioned last time. It's quite a potentially difficult, or at first you may not be aware where this sound of al-hams or where this characteristic of al-hams comes from. So we have the letter da, as we said, coming from the tip of the tongue, and we have the sound at. So we have a hamza before, a sukoon on the da, and we've got the sound at. So here we have an example of a quite common mistake which is made, and it's to do with the characteristic of al-hams. And what actually happens is, wrongly, when reciting this word, is an extra letter is added in. And that extra letter is the letter sin. So we should only be stopping on a ta, as you can see here. But sometimes what happens is there's an addition of the letter sin. And that is all taken from this characteristic of al-hams. So instead of hearing the sound at, where you have that expulsion of the breath and the tongue staying on the point of origin of da, which is behind those top teeth, the tongue actually drops down behind the bottom teeth, which is the makhraj, the point of origin of sin, and you have this this kind of disturbance of sound where you have the sound S or the letter sin coming through. So you hear the sound at, and you probably have heard this in some recitations. Obviously, by not sticking to the makhraj of the ta, that's one issue. Secondly, by moving to the makhraj, the point of origin of sin, we've not allowed ourselves to fulfill the characteristic of al-hams with the ta. So another thing to point out, first aside, we said that when the letter has a sukun and it's stronger than a vowel. The second thing at which I want us to take from this is that specifically with the letter ta, and specifically when it is sakina, when it has a sukun on, there should be no disturbance with the letter sin, and it should stay completely as the letter ta. So it doesn't sound like at, but it stays as a ta, and you have the sound at. So it's a lot softer, and don't let that fool you into thinking that the sound isn't strong enough, because it is as strong as it needs to be, because you're staying at the correct point of origin. So we have an example here, the beginning of Surah Masad, we have Tabbat yada. So we have the exact thing which we've just been seeing above. So this is quite simple to understand, and we've got the connection of the ta sakina with the fatha before it. So what you hear this being incorrectly, and I'll draw it in a different color just so that we are aware, incorrectly recited as so you hear this sound tabbat yada tabbat, and you have this kind of S sound coming through. So that is a common mistake which is made with a ta sakina. This sin which sometimes is added in should not be there at all, because we're actually adding in a characteristic and adding in a point of origin which shouldn't be there. The release of the breath should stay as a ta release of breath, because we're staying on that point of origin. So you close off the ta and say tabbat, staying at the point of origin, and then release. Tabbat. Okay. So I hope that's come across well over the audio that we've got here. But essentially, keep your tongue at the point of origin of the ta, and don't allow a sound of sin to come in with this letter, especially when it's sakina. Okay. Any questions on that just before we move on? Okay, so we have the 10 letters as we mentioned, so 28 letters altogether, and these are the 10 letters which have hams. That means that when they're recited, there's a release of breath, which is quite natural. When they are sakina, the characteristic is going to be increased compared to when the letter is just voweled. And specifically with the letter ta sakina, there should be no addition of the letter or sound S or letter sin, which would be incorrect and would move that letter to a different point of origin. Okay, so some have asked this question: what is the mnemonic starting with an M? A mnemonic is, I'll answer that question in a second from Aisha. A mnemonic is a collection of a group of letters which are grouped for a certain purpose, for ease of memorization or for ease of teaching. So we've got here a mnemonic, which is a link of all these 10 letters put in a sentence to allow ourselves to quickly refer to them and know exactly what they are. So we'll just read it through. The phrase is, and apologies for the quality, it has gone a little bit blurry. The phrase is فحثه شخص سكت. فحثه شخص سكت. And obviously, if you were to put your hand in front of your mouth, because all of these letters are mahmusa, because all of them have this characteristic, you'll be able to feel the breath on all of them. And most importantly, that ta sakina on the end, we're not going to add in any seen sound, which would take from its original point of origin. So again, just as an aside, it's just to allow us to quickly recollect what these 10 letters are. You can either write out the Arabic or write out the English transliteration, and it'll just help with referring to them in the future. So the question is asked, when the letters of hams have a shadda, should the breath be expelled? It should be expelled just as it was before, because a shadda is a combination of a sukoon and a vowel. So you've got kind of got an increase here, or a doubling up. So you have got the initial sukoon and then the vowel of itself. And to be honest, we can see an example here in the first word, فَحَثَّهُ, فَحَثَّهُ. There's no way of reciting that tha, that third letter in, despite it having a shadda on without al-hams. So if you stopped with a sakina on that and you said fahath, fahath, and then started with it, thahu, you would recite hams in both. So it's just a merging of the two natural characteristics which are coming together, more so from the fact that shadda brings those two letters together rather than any difference with the tha. So the question completely valid. Breath should be expelled as naturally it would do if it were a separate sukoon and voweled letter. Okay. So that's the characteristic of al-hams, the first characteristic which we're seeing today. It relates to 10 letters of the 28 of the Quranic alphabet. It means a release of breath during recitation. If the letter has a sukoon on it, the characteristic is increased. We need to be aware of a ta sakina to make sure there's no seen sound coming through. And we've got the mnemonic فَحَثَّهُ شَخْصٌ سَكَتْ to help us memorize and to help us relate back to this characteristic. So quite a simple one. It may be one that we've not heard of before, but it just makes sure that all of these letters which naturally have this characteristic are increased, especially when they have a shadda on, and it just allows for a bit more clarity when we're reciting. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to our second characteristic. And this is probably one which most of you have heard of, because maybe it's one of the more natural ones or one which is very easy to teach. And this is the characteristic of al-qalqalah. Al-qalqalah. So al-qalqalah is described as a shake or echo when a letter is sakina. So before with al-hams, it could have been a voweled or a sakina letter, but this is only talking about a letter that is sakina. And we're talking about a specific shake or echo with this sakina letter. Of the 28, it only relates to 5 of the letters. So of the 28, it only relates to 5. The origin of this word al-qalqalah, and you can probably hear with the onomatopoeia of the word and the fact that the letters are repeated, you have this vibration or this echo sound already within the word. And it said that in the old Arab phrase, people would have said that the pot or the cauldron which is on top of the coals or the embers or the fire, the pot itself is shaking because of the liquid or the water which is within it. So it's not completely still, nor is the water so violent that it's coming out, but it's just kind of this shaking which stays in its position as that water is boiling. So I think that imagery helps when we're going to describe exactly what al-qalqalah is. So as I said, it's quite a common characteristic to go through. So I'm going to ask you all now what the 5 letters are of al-qalqalah, and then we'll see them all on the next page. So ba, qaf, 2 good examples. And we've got all 5 there. Qaf, ta, jim, dal. Perfect. So quite quickly, we've got all of those letters. I say it's quite a common characteristic to be taught. So we can see the 5 letters here, and those are the 5 letters of qaf, ta, ba, jim, and dal. And we said that it's not when these letters just have a vowel on, but it's when these letters have a sakina on. So if we go through them with a sakina on and with a fatha before, we'd have the sounds. And if you want to practice with, that would be ideal. We have the sounds aqa, aqa, alta, alta, ab, ab, aj, aj, and ad, ad. Perfect. So it's quite natural for this characteristic, just as we said, al-hams, to come through. All of these letters have a different characteristic called shidda, which we're not covering in this course, but shidda means that the sound which comes out comes to a complete stop. So in reciting these letters, the sound comes to a complete stop. So if we take the letter ba, the 2 lips are coming together and we say ab, ab, and you can see the 2 lips coming together. And that's that characteristics of shidda, which for our sake is just the stopping of sound during recitation. But if we just stop there, because 2 bits of our anatomy, in this case, our 2 lips have come together, there's no way of getting out from that unless you release. And one way would be to add a vowel on, but we're saying that this letter is sakina. So the only way that we can actually release between those two parts coming together is with al-qalqalah. So we've got ad, ad. You've got the tip of the tongue going behind the teeth. And if you were to just close it and say ad, you would kind of just build up the pressure and you would need that release. So that's what al-qalqalah allows. It allows this natural echo, shake, vibration to come through with these 5 specific letters when there's sakina, to allow the sound to come through and to stop it from being held in. So the 5 letters of al-qalqalah. So again, we'll just go through on the whiteboard and talk through some examples and some things to be aware of. So we'll have the few examples of each of them. So we've got the word قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ, and we normally stop on that ayah. So you've got the word al-falaq, and we've got the example here of a qaf with a sukoon on. So what is this going to be an example of? Of qalqalah. We're going to echo this sound. We're not going to hold the qaf in its point of origin at the back of the tongue, but we're going to allow this natural bounce to come through and say al-falaq, al-falaq, al-falaq. And you can hear that kind of echo, that's that echo coming through quite easily. We'll take Surah Masad again, as we did before. Tabbat yada abi lahab. And if again we were going to stop there, we'd have a ba sakina, which would be an example of qalqalah. So we don't just completely close off the ba, but we allow that natural echo, that natural vibration to come through, and we have the word lahab, lahab, lahab. That natural echo coming through with the ba sakina. Last example, we'll take the letter dal. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ Allahu as-samad. So again, we're adding a sukoon on here because we're stopping at the end of this ayah. That gives us an example of qalqalah, and we don't just hold the tongue at the tip of the tongue at the top of the mouth, but we allow this natural echo to come through. Allahu as-samad, as-samad, as-samad. Okay, so we've got 3 examples here. Al-falaq, as-samad. lahab. So again, a natural coming through of this echo or vibration with these letters when they have a sukoon on. Okay. So I'll just erase this last one, just as we're doing some examples. Okay. So obviously all the examples that we've seen here on the right-hand side are examples when the letter, which is muqalqal, the letter which has qalqalah on, is at the end of the word. Does it mean that the qalqalah letter always has to be at the end of the word? No, it doesn't. It can be within the actual letter. So we've got the word iqtaraba, iqtaraba. So again, we can see a qaf here within the actual word, and it has a sukoon on, which makes it an example of qalqalah. So we'd say iqa, not completely closing off that qaf to allow this characteristic to come through. And again, we'll just see one more example of qalqalah within a letter. We've got the beginning of Surah Al-Fajr. We've got wal fajri. And again, we've got an example of a jim here with a sakina on. We've got that natural echo, that natural bounce coming through. So we've got iqtaraba, and wal fajri. So one thing to point out now on an aside, we said that all of these have the characteristics of shidda, which we said is completely closing off the sound which comes out. The exact opposite of that would be to allow a vowel to come out. So rather than completely closing off, you're actually putting a vowel on the letter and a complete vowel to allow the sound to come through. So if we take this top left example of iqtaraba, if we were completely closing off, what would it sound like? Iqtaraba, and we'd kind of like have this closing off from the back of the throat where that point of makhraj is. If we're going to the exact opposite and we're actually going to add a vowel onto that letter, in this case, let's add a fatha and we would say iqtaraba. What have we done there? We've not just bounced the letter, we've actually gone that far that we've actually added a vowel onto the letter. So these are two extremes when thinking about qalqalah. One is complete inhibas, complete closing off of the sound, and the opposite is going that far that you're actually adding a vowel onto the letter. Al-qalqalah is a balance between the two. You aren't closing off the sound, but you're not going to the other extreme where you're actually adding a vowel onto the letter. And that should allow this understanding of an echo or a bounce of the letter to come through. So it's actually between complete no sound and a vowel. So we don't have iqtaraba or iqtaraba. Between the two, iqtaraba. Okay. So qalqalah should be a balance between no sound and a vowel to allow that bounce to come through. Okay. Next question is, we have a couple of examples here. We've said that qalqalah can come at the end of a word, like these two on the right-hand side, or they can come in the middle of a word, like on the left-hand side. Just as we did with al-hams, we said, is it stronger just with a vowel or with a sakina? Here we're going to ask that same question, but ask, is the qalqalah stronger when the qalqalah is at the end of the words here on the right-hand side, or is it stronger when it's in the middle of the words, as you can see on the left, or is there no difference between the two? What do we think in the chat box? Perfect. So most people seem to have answered correctly, and that is the fact that al-qalqalah is stronger when it's at the end. Okay, I'll just go over that for 1 second. So we've got here on the screen again the two types of al-qalqalah. We've got one called al-kubra and one called as-sughra. And we know the word kabir or the word akbar, which we know means the big or greatest. And this is a feminine word, so it changes from kabir to kubra, which means big. And the opposite of that, we have saghir, asghar, as-sughra to make it feminine, which means small. So two types of al-qalqalah. You've got al-qalqalah al-kubra and al-qalqalah as-sughra. Al-qalqalah al-kubra, the big qalqalah, or the one with more strength, is when the letter, talking about the letter which is undergoing al-qalqalah here, is at the end of a saying. So that links into all the people that said al-qalqalah is stronger for those examples that we had on the right-hand side. Al-qalqalah is kubra, is bigger when at the end of a saying. Whereas the examples that we had on the left, iqtaraba and wal fajri, when the qalqalah letter is in the middle of a saying, it's a smaller qalqalah compared to when it's at the end. It's kind of more of an academic difference. When the qalqalah letter is at the end of a word or a saying, it's going to be bigger just because you're stopping on that sentence. So I don't think there's anything quite naturally that you need to do different, but just be aware of the difference, especially when it comes towards the end of a saying, to strengthen that qalqalah, because it definitely comes under the category of al-kubra. So al-kubra and as-sughra, big and small, two differences, whether it's at the end or whether it's in the middle, determines whether it's big or small. Okay. But if we look at the way that this has been explained, it doesn't say at the end of a word, it doesn't say at the end of a verse, it says at the end of a saying. And that's been put in italic, and it's said very specifically for a reason which we'll go through now. So al-kubra and as-sughra, but there is an aside to talk through. So we have the verse in Surah Al-Ikhlas, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ, and then لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. So I'll just write that out now and we'll just talk through that. So لم يلد. Okay, so I'll just write the two dals in a different color just so that we can see the difference, so be more aware of where they are. So لم يلد ولم يولد, a phrase or a sentence that we're quite aware of. This is one ayah within the Quran, so more than often we're going to be reciting this ayah in completion. So if I recite this ayah in completion and I number this number 1, is this an example of as-sughra or al-kubra? What do we think? So we're reciting this ayah in completion, all the way from the beginning to the end. Is this one that I've marked as 1, is it sughra or kubra? Sughra. So most people have said it is a sughra, and that is correct, because we said that it is when a sughra is described as when the qalqalah letter comes in the middle of a saying. And now we are categorizing this whole ayah as a saying. So we've not said, that's why we didn't say verse or word, because we're saying this ayah in entirety. So this whole thing now becomes a saying. So this now becomes as middle of the saying, so it becomes a sughra. Whereas this, if we're saying we're going to stop here, this naturally, what is this an example of? A sughra or al-kubra? Alhamdulillah, yeah. So that is an example of kubra. Why? Because it's a muqalqal, a letter of qalqala, which has a sakina on at the end of a saying. So this becomes an example of qalqala al-kubra. So we've got here an ayah which has two examples, one of as-sughra and one of al-kubra. So al-kubra is going to be stronger because it's at the end, whereas the first as-sughra is smaller or not as strong because it's in the middle. So we say لم يلد ولم يولد لم يلد ولم يولد لم يلد ولم يولد. So quite distinct, but there's definitely a difference between the two. The first one, because it's a sughra, isn't as strong as the second, being al-kubra. Second point is, despite the fact that we've said that, if we are just going to delete what we've done, and this time, instead of stopping at the end of the ayah, we're actually going to stop here. So we'll say, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ. So we're starting at the beginning of Surah Al-Ikhlas, and we're going to say, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ, and stop there. Question now, it was a surah when we recited that ayat by itself. Is it now still a surah, or has it changed to al-kubra? What do we think? Perfect. So I think we've got the idea there. Because now this example is not in the middle of a saying, it's actually at the end of a saying. It's not a surah, despite the fact that it's in the middle of an ayah. Because it's at the end of a saying, it's an example of qalqalah al-kubra. If we were then to kind of repeat the ayah, starting from the beginning again and reciting through, it would change from kubra to sughra. So we'll just see an example of that. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ al-kubra لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. It's now gone down to a surah because it's become within or in the middle of a saying. So again, quite specific, but it's just an understanding that there's two categorizations of al-qalqalah, a larger and a smaller. The larger one is at the end of a saying, and anything that's not at the end of a saying doesn't have as strong a qalqalah. And the second point is, despite the fact that the majority of the time a letter within a sentence would be a sughra because you'd normally read the verse or the ayah in entirety, if you do end up stopping on a letter within an ayah which has a qalqalah letter at the end of it, despite the fact that it's in the middle of a ayah, it becomes an example of qalqalah al-kubra, because we've said that the translation or the types are when al-qalqalah comes at the end or middle of a saying rather than a word or a verse. So I hope that's come across quite well for you. An example of qalqalah, al-kubra and al-sughra, and an understanding of what they are and how they can change. Okay. So al-qalqalah, the echo, a natural echo with these 5 letters. Just as before, we've got a mnemonic which kind of links these 5 letters together. There's different variations. You'll hear qutbu jaddin, qutubu jadin, all different variations of vowels or shadda. All are correct because it's just kind of used as an aid memoir to help us understand and recollect what these 5 letters are. Okay. So that is al-qalqalah. We've talked through the fact that there are 2 types, al-kubra and al-sughra, gone through some examples and said it's with whether the letter of these 5 are at the end or the middle of a saying. So we've been through 2 of the characteristics now, al-hams, which is the natural release of breath, and al-qalqalah, which is a natural echoing of these 5 letters. When they're sakina, if they're at the end, then they're stronger than if they are within a saying. Okay. Before we go on to our next characteristic, we're just going to, just as we did before, just talk through some things which may potentially go wrong when it comes to al-qalqalah. So we know when it should go right, as we've just seen some examples of that. So when it goes wrong is when we see examples of al-qalqalah when we shouldn't. So it only relates to these 5 letters, but if we see examples of qalqalah on other letters, that's when it wouldn't be a correct recitation. Okay. So one letter which we see qalqalah being practiced upon when it shouldn't be is the letter mim. So we'll see the word Yamliku, yamliku. So again, we've got a sakina meme, but meme's not one of the letters of these five of al-qalqalah. So there should be no echoing on this letter meme, and it should be completely connected to the ya before. So if it were to be recited incorrectly, you'd hear an echo, and you'd hear the sound yamaliku, yamaliku, yamaliku. So again, we've not added a vowel on, but we've not completely closed off as we should either. We've added this extra bounce when it shouldn't be there. So what should we do? We should completely close off that meme and not add any extra echo or add any qalqalah onto this letter. And that would be a correct recitation. And we'd hear the sound yam, yam, yamliku, yamliku. Okay. The second letter where we see examples of al-qalqalah being added is an example of a word in Surah Al-Fatiha. Okay, so we have the word an'amta, an'amta. So again, we've got a noon sakina here connected to the hamza fatha before. Noon is not one of the letters of al-qalqalah, so there should be no echo on this sound, nor are we going to be adding a vowel on because this letter is sakina. So if you were to hear it incorrectly with the mistake, you'd hear the sound an'amta, 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 and you don't hear this noon being completely closed off, but it should be completely closed because there's no qalqalah here, and you have the word an'amta, an'amta, صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم. So just completely closing off that noon, so that there's no qalqalah, there's no bounce on that letter. We'll see another example, the letter lam, and the word al-insan. Al-insan. So here we're talking about the letter lam, lam, and a lot of the time it's when it has this particle of al before. Al means the, and then you relate it to a letter, so it's connected to it. But in that connection, sometimes qalqalah creeps into this letter lam, despite the fact that it has a sukoon on, and you hear this bouncing on this letter as well. So you hear the sound ala insanu, ala, ala, ala. You hear this echoing on the letter lam. It's sakina, it should be completely closed off. It's not one of the letters of qalqalah. So you should hear the sound al-insan, al-insan. Okay, so completely closed off, just like with the noon and the meme. One last example, so seeing meme, noon, lam, some common examples. To be honest, any of the letters can have this error creep in, but these are just some of the letters which we're going to go through. One of the more important ones is the letter hamza. So we've got the word here, yu'minun, yu'minun. So again, similar kind of thing. We've got a hamza with a sukoon on. It should be completely connected to that dhamma beforehand. It's not one of the letters of qalqalah, so there should be no echoing there. But if you do hear the echo, you'd hear the sound yu'a, 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 yu'minuna, yu'minuna, which is obviously an addition of a characteristic which shouldn't be there. This hamza should be completely closed off, and you hear the sound yu, 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 yu'minun, yu'minun. Okay. So we've gone through when it should be there. We've gone through a couple of examples when it shouldn't be there. The letters of mim, nun, lam, yamliku, an'amta, al-insan. And lastly, the letter hamza, yu'minun, where there should be no qalqalah because it's not one of the 5 letters which we've talked about coming in this category. Okay. So with that, we'll move on to our next characteristic of the 6 which we'll see today. The first 2 which we've seen are, I'd say, potentially the most important, or the ones which we'll spend the most time going through because they pertain or link into the majority of the letters or a bigger bulk of the letters compared to the last few that we'll see. And they may be more natural because these letters are more often occurring. The sound is more natural that comes through. So of the 6, these 2 are kind of on top. That's why we've done them first, and then the next few characteristics subsequent to that. Okay. The next characteristic which we're going to see, number 3, is called as-safir. As-safir. And as-safir is described as a sharp whistling or buzzing sound. A sharp whistling or buzzing sound. And even within the words whistling and buzzing, you can hear the sound of what we're trying to talk about. And it relates to 3 letters of the alphabet. So we had 10, then 5, and now we've only got 3 which we're talking about. Which 3 of the 28 letters do we think have a whistling or buzzing sound? Whistling or buzzing sound? Perfect. We've got some examples out. Exactly those letters which we have talked about. There we go, perfect. Sorry, I don't know what happened to the screen. So we've just talked through the fact that it's a sharp whistling or buzzing sound, and we've had in the chat box the 3 examples, which we're now going to see, the 3 letters of Sad, Zai, and Sin. Sad, Zai, and Sin. Can anyone remember which point of origin these 3 letters came from? Lisan, correct. It does come from the tongue. Which part of the tongue does it come from? Tip. And can we remember the word that was used in Arabic to describe the tip? Testing. So we've had tip off, dot off there. I think that was dot off, which was the word which we were hoping for. So it comes from these 3 letters come from the tongue, and they come from the tip of the tongue, as was correctly said. And that is in Arabic, taraful lisan. Sad, Zai, and Sin is when the tip of the tongue tucks behind those bottom teeth, and they all come from the same point of origin. Because of the fact that the tip of the tongue tucks behind, you have that strengthening of the tongue as it tucks behind those bottom teeth. And that allows this characteristic of as-safir to come through. Again, as-safir is a natural characteristic, but by being aware of it, it allows that characteristic to be strengthened as much as we can. So if we just put a fatha on each of these letters, we can see an example of that, and we say sa, sa, sa. Second letter, za, z, z. And lastly, sa, sa, sa. Perfect. And then if we take these letters and put a fatha before them, we have as, as, and as. So it's quite easy to see that all of these 3 letters, they come under this characteristic of as-safir, and it's quite a natural characteristic to enact just because of the point of origin of these letters. So again, if we just see some examples of this characteristic in action, despite the fact that it's quite a natural one, we have the 3 words which will show these letters. Again, if we take Surat An-Nasr, we have okay, so we've got 3 examples here, each of one of each of those letters, and all come from the last few surahs, so we should be aware of these words. First one with the letter Sad. The Sad has a sakina on in this example. And again, we're just wanting this natural characteristic of the buzzing or whistling sound of the letter Sad to come through. So we say Nasru, 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 Nasru. And you can hear that whistling sound come through. Again, naturally it's going to come through, but we're just wanting to strengthen it to allow this characteristic of as-safir to be as present as we can. The next one, the zilzalaha, and again chosen because we've got a double example of the zai at the beginning and the third letter as well. So we say إذا زلزلت الأرض زلزالها زلزالها زلزالها. You can hear that natural characteristic coming through. Last one, waswasi, waswasi, waswasi. And again, it's not anything that you need to do differently, but just be aware of this characteristic and allow it to come through as strong as possible with these three specific letters. So we had Sad, Zai, and Sin, all coming from the same point of origin. They're characterized as the letters of as-safir, and that's because they have this natural buzzing or whistling sound which comes with them, as we've seen in the examples here. Okay. So because there's only three letters, there's no mnemonic to be able to know what they are, and because they come from the same point of origin anyway, it's quite easy to know what those three letters are. Okay, so that was as-safir as our third characteristic. Question that's come through: when we say natural characteristic, does that mean there are some unnatural or emphasized characteristics and other natural? If you're not Arabic, it's not natural, no. Okay. By natural, I mean, I guess I do mean as a person who is trying to speak Arabic. So if your tongue goes to the correct point of origin, for example, if we take the letter Sin here, if you're saying it should sound like as we see it written in English, S-E-E-N, and our tongue is going to the correct point of origin. Our tip of the tongue is tucking behind those teeth, and we say Sin, Sin, then in ways of describing what that is, you've gone to the correct point of origin, and what would have naturally come through because you've done that is coming through. So that's what's meant by something natural. Okay. How would you make it unnatural? If you were to do something which shouldn't be there. So if we take the letter Sin, you should be opening the mouth. And for example, if you were kind of closing your mouth and saying Sin, Sin, then that would be an unnatural way to say the letter. So again, if you start from that basic level and you say, these are what the letters are, these are the points of origin, these are the characteristics, and you build up from there, hopefully that would build up a natural progression between something simple to something potentially more complicated. But in each of those steps, it would seem natural because you've built up from that natural position. As an aside to that, I don't think you could say anything was unnatural. Everything is natural if you're doing it correctly and it is having the characteristics that it should have. So yeah, I don't think there should be an understanding of something being unnatural, so to speak. Okay. So these are the three letters of as-safir, as we said. These three letters which have the characteristic of buzzing or whistling associated with them. Okay. The next characteristic which we're going to see is one called At-tafashi. 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 Okay. And At-tafashi is described as a spreading towards the teeth. A spreading towards the teeth. And as I said, with the first characteristic, we had 10, then 5, then 3. Now we've only got one letter which it relates to. And for the next three, each of them are only going to have one letter which they relate to. Again, more distinct characteristics which we're now talking about. This characteristic of At-tafashi only relates to one letter of the Arabic alphabet, and that is the letter Sheen. The letter Sheen. Question: where does the letter Sheen come from? What point of origin is there for the letter Sheen? So again, correct lisan, it does come from the tongue, and we said that the tongue has 4 different categorizations. So within that, which part of the tongue does it come from? Middle, perfect. And for bonus points, how do we say middle in Arabic? We've got the answer there, wasat. So wasatul lisan is where 3 letters come from, jim, sheen, and ya. And we're talking about we're talking about sheen specifically here. We said that sheen is when the middle of the tongue comes towards the roof of the mouth, but you don't have complete connection there. You don't have complete connection between the middle of the tongue and the top of the mouth, but there is a definite pressure which is held in the tongue to allow that sound to come through, and that allows the letter sheen, sheen, or sh to come through, sh. If we keep that middle of the tongue on that exact position, because we're holding that pressure there of the middle of the tongue, it's difficult for the sound to come out because of that increased pressure. So if I actually do it to explain to you what it would sound like, if you're holding that pressure of the letter sheen there with increased pressure now, so not just going to the point of origin, but actually holding pressure there, you have the sound sh, 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 sh. So your tongue's not moving, but you've got the middle of the tongue trying to hold pressure against the roof of the mouth. What this characteristic is saying is that, yes, you hold the pressure of the middle of the tongue, but the sound would be enhanced or perfected if the tip of the tongue or the whole tongue moved towards the teeth. So yes, the origin of the letter is the middle of the tongue, but with this characteristic, you're actually pushing that pressure of the middle of the tongue towards the teeth to allow the sound to be perfected. So that's where we get the sound sh, sh, sh. So if you now actively try and push your tongue towards your teeth when saying that letter, you'll see that it has an increased strength. And that is what At-tafashi is trying to enact. Okay, so we'll see an example of this again. So again, in our last 10 surah, we've got li'ilafi Quraysh. And we normally stop on the end of this ayah. So despite the fact that it has a kasra tanween, we'll pretend that we're stopping, or we'll, for this example, say that we are stopping on this letter. Okay. So again, we've got an example here of a sheen. Despite the fact that it could be voweled or it could be sakina. In this example, it's sakina. And we're saying we want to increase this characteristic of at-tafashi. So not only do we have the letter sheen, not only is our tongue, our middle of the tongue, going towards the roof of the mouth, but we're going to push the middle of the tongue towards the teeth to allow the sound of this letter to be perfected. So if it was just going to stay at the middle of the tongue and not move towards the teeth, what would it sound like? لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشٍ. Okay, so it's still correct, but it's not being perfected as much as it can. Now, if we move the tongue towards the tip of the towards the teeth, towards those back teeth from the middle of the tongue, we'll have that perfection of the letter, and we'll hear the sound Quraysh, Quraysh, ash, sh. Okay, so it's more of a natural characteristic, and again, I don't want to confuse by using the word natural, but if we know that the sound should be sh, we know that the tongue, the middle of the tongue, should be increasing pressure towards the roof of the mouth, and now we know that the tongue should be moving towards the teeth to allow this sound to come through. We will get this kind of natural leveling kind of playing out because we followed that criteria. Now we want to increase it as much as we can. So we say, لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشٍ, لِإِيلَافِ قُرَيْشٍ. So you actually stop there or stay on this letter and push the tongue towards the teeth to allow this characteristic to come through. A a relatively simple characteristic to explain, but maybe one which needs to be practiced more. There's not many sheens within the Quran, so li'ila fi Quraysh is a good one to practice on. And again, it's simply just the makhraj, the point of origin of the middle of the tongue moving towards the teeth to allow this letter to come through. So that was At-tafashi, which was related to the letter sheen. The next example we've got is the letter, the next characteristic which we've got is the characteristic of Al-istitiaalah. Al-istitiaalah. Al-istitiaalah is described as an elongated pressure towards the teeth. An elongated pressure towards the teeth. And again, it only relates to one letter of the Arabic alphabet. We've got the 28, and this only relates to the one letter, the letter Dad. The letter Dad. So again, we'll go through the same way we went previously. Where does the letter Dad come from? I like how, Naeem, you're giving everybody else the chance to get the bonus marks by saying lisan each time. You're correct each time, but I'll always ask which part of the tongue, sides of the tongue, حافة اللسان, so it's with a H, Salma, not with a K. حافة اللسان is the letter Dad, correct. So we said that with the letter Dad, you have the side of your tongue, and one will provide the sides of your tongue, and one will provide more pressure than the other, and it's going towards the roof of the mouth, next to where the teeth are, and then by touching onto that area, you have complete connection, and there's pressure built up. What this rule is saying is that there should be an elongated pressure as the tongue goes towards the teeth. So I think the best way to see it is with an example, so we'll go on to that now. So again, we're talking about the letter Dad, and we're talking about an elongated amount of pressure towards the teeth to allow this characteristic to be put into practice. So again, from our last surah, we've got the first ayah of Surah Al-Duha, and we've got the word Al-Duha. So we've got the letter Dad here, the letter Dad, and it so happens that the letter Dad here has a shadda on. It's connected to the fatha previously on the waw, and it also has its own vowel. So this is kind of the highest level that we can get a Dad on, because it's got a shadda on, and it's essentially going to be doubled up, connecting to the waw before, and also having its own vowel. So if we take the first part and we say that the Dad is connecting to the letter previous, here it is a waw. We have, if we just assume that the alif lam isn't there, we go straight to the Dad, we have the phrase wad, if we're adding those two together. So we've already got an increase of that pressure because we're going to the makhraj, to the point of origin of Dad. So we can feel the sides of the tongue coming to the roof of the mouth, and what they're doing is they're holding there because there is a sakina there, which is connecting it to the letter previous. So if we practice that first and we say wad, it's easy to stop quite soon into going into that characteristic or going into the point of origin of that letter because of the increase in pressure, and it's a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit unnatural to feel that. So you could just say wad, and kind of cut it off quite soon. What this characteristic is saying is that this pressure which you're building up should actually be elongated as much as you can. So it shouldn't be of just going to the point of origin and stopping there, but if you can hold your tongue there and actually allow this pressure to increase, that will allow this characteristic to come through. So not only do you have this addition of the Dad with the sakina onto the waw previous, but you've also got the Dad then adding onto its own vowel and taking a dhamma. So you've got wad-du. So it's in this kind of conjunction between the two from here all the way to getting its vowel that you're having this al-istitaala characteristic coming through. Okay, so if we practice that a few times, and again, we're wanting to hold our side of the tongue on the roof of the mouth to allow this pressure to come through, and we say, وَالضُّحَى وَالضُّحَى وَالضُّحَى. And again, if I just stop on the first part, and hopefully you can hear it, well. Okay, so you can kind of feel and slightly hear this pressure building up to allow this characteristic of al-istitaala coming through. It's only related to the letter Dad. I think others would say that or you may say kind of anecdotally that the letter Ain is one that makes Arabic quite distinct, but I feel like Dad also makes the Arabic sound or the Quranic sound quite distinct, and I think this characteristic adds into that quite well because it's this pressure which we're building up, which we're not used to building up, to allow this characteristic to come through. So al-istitaala is a hoping or a seeking for elongated pressure of the letter Dad from the sides of the tongue towards the teeth, and that allows this characteristic to be perfected. Okay, so that's al-istitaala. So we've gone through 5 of the 6, al-hams, al-qalqalah, al-safir, at-tafashi, and al-istitaala. And altogether they go through the 10, 5, and then 1, 1, 3, 1, 1 of the letters. And for all of these characteristics, we've said that we've described what it is to be able to put that characteristic into action. For the last one, which is called at-takreer, we are covering this rule to be aware of it so that we're not putting it into action. So it's the exact opposite. So in your notes or where you're writing down, I just want you to get a different colored pen, red pen, and just put some stars around this just so that you're aware that although we're going through it as a characteristic, it's for the reasoning and for the purpose of it not being put into practice because of what we're describing. So at-takreer is described as repeating or rolling. And it relates to the one letter again, the letter Ra. And as we've said, it's the only characteristic which should not be practiced out of the 6 that we've seen. And to be honest, out of all of the characteristics that you can go through, it's the only characteristic which is there for completion so that it's not practiced. Again, we'll just go through an example, and we can take the example from the Basmala or from Surah Al-Fatiha, and we'll take the word Ar-Rahman. Okay, so again, we've got an example of a Ra here. This characteristic of takreer, you're more than likely going to see it when a Ra, because this is the only letter which it relates to, is sakina or mushaddad. When it has a sakina on, a sukoon on, or has a shadda on. It's quite difficult to see this characteristic in action when it's just a vowel, although it's a potential depending on how you recite. A rolling of the letter R is something that we're quite aware of in other languages such as English. And you'd hear the sound ri, or ra, kind of a natural ringing or rolling of the letter R. And it's the exact same thing which is now being taught against with the letter Ra in Arabic, in Quranic Arabic. If you were to recite it incorrectly without perfecting that letter and to put this characteristic of at-takreer into action, you'd say Ar-Ra, Ar-Rahman, and you hear this repeating or rolling or doubling up of the letter Ra. And with this characteristic, as I said, it should be reduced or removed as much as we can. Not an ideal characteristic to perfect the letter. And we'd hear the sound, if we are perfecting, Ar-Ra, Ar-Rahman. What's the reasoning of why we get this characteristic of at-takreer being put into play? It could just be natural. It could just be that some people are used to rolling their R's and then find it difficult to not roll their R's or roll their Ra's when reciting Arabic. The second reason it could be is that the tip of the tongue, where the Ra comes from, has not achieved its potential in pressure or strength, and because of that, you have this kind of laxity of the tongue, and that kind of movement doesn't allow the tongue to stick where it's supposed to be. And that's why you have this rolling, which shouldn't be there, which should be removed as much as you can. So we're not hearing arra, arra, we're hearing arra, arra. And then as the word, ar-Rahman, ar-Rahman, ar-Rahman. So again, having that strength of the tip of the tongue, so that it's not moving about, it's not rolling, and that will allow this characteristic of at-takreer to be removed as much as possible. Okay. So we've covered today some characteristics of the letters, the most important ones which we'll be able to put into practice. 6 of them which we've covered are al-hams, which we said is the release of breath. It relates to 10 letters of the alphabet of the 28. Quite seeming characteristics in that they're quite natural. For example, we went through the letter ha, where you can feel the breath coming through. We've said that when these letters have a sakina on, the characteristic of al-hams is increased compared to when it's only voweled. We've said to be aware of the letter ta when it's sakina, that there's no s or sin sound coming in, which could change the letter or could add hams. It could add hams of a different letter into the recitation. Then we've gone on to al-qalqalah, which we've said is an echo of the sound when it relates to 5 sakina letters of qutbu jaddin. We've said that there's 2 types, al-qalqalah al-kubra and al-sughra. Al-kubra when the letter is at the end of a saying, and al-sughra when it's in the middle. And we've talked about the differentiation that you can move between the two because it's at the end of a saying rather than at the end of an ayah or at the end of a word. And then again, we've talked through some examples of when qalqalah can come in mistakenly, especially on the letters mim, lam, hamza. So just to be aware of, if it's not one of those 5, then al-qalqalah shouldn't be put into practice. Then we had as-safir, the 3 whistling or buzzing sounds, letters sad, za, and sin. So examples of that. At-tafashi, the letter sheen, the spreading of the middle of the tongue towards the teeth to allow this characteristic to come through with the letter sheen. Al-istitiaalah, very similar, elongated pressure of the sides of the tongue towards the roof of the mouth next to the teeth to allow this characteristic to come through for the letter dad. And lastly, at-takreer, which is a repeating or a rolling of the ra, which shouldn't be there, which should be removed from our recitation as much as possible to allow the letter ra to be perfected. Alhamdulillah. So if anybody has any questions now, then we'll go through them, and if not, we'll start our short practice for the end of today's session. As we've seen today, now that we have done a few lessons, I'm quite keen on participation. Despite the platform that we have, which is remote, there's still an opportunity for this to be interactive. And the only way that it can be interactive is if I'm asking questions and you're giving answers. So if you've given answers today, tabarakallah, mashallah, really proud of the fact that you've stepped up and kind of used this platform for that. Even if you've known the answers, that's great. But if you have been a little bit unsure about what the answers are, over the next week, it's a good opportunity to revise the modules that we've gone through already. Especially for next week, things are going to be moving from a kind of base level where we've just been talking about single letters, single characteristics of letters, and we're really going to start building up on things now and kind of joining different letters together and seeing how everything comes together. And you can only do that, as we said, وَرَدُّ كُلِّ وَاحِدٍ لِأَصْلِهِ, when we said in the poem at the beginning, everything comes back to its origin. And if the origins aren't stable or correct or firm, then it's difficult to build on that stably and not to have a full understanding of, inshallah, what we're going to be going through. So I kind of request that we do revise what we're going through so that, inshallah, over the coming weeks, everything is seamless and we can continue on that build-up from the original information that we've been through. So alhamdulillah, we'll go on to our practice now. We've been going through the istitiaalah and the basmala, and today we'll start Surah Al-Fatiha. The reason that we've chosen this is because it's the most commonly recited surah in the Quran for us all, and it's good to be aware of potential mistakes that could creep in. And also now that we have gone through the makharij and we've gone through the sifat, the origins and the characteristics of the letter, we've got the opportunity now to actually see them in action. So we could even go back to the last couple of weeks of practice and add in those extra bits of information which we have now, but we'll leave that for self-study after today, inshallah. So we went through the isti'aadah in week 1, the basmala last week, and today we'll go through the first ayah of Surah Al-Fatiha. Okay. Bismillah. So we've got the first word, alhamdu, alhamdu. First thing to note is we've got the letter lam there, and we said that it's a common mistake to do qalqalah, to have this echo on the letter lam, especially with the particle al, and you'd hear ala, ala, ala. So we really need to close off that sakina and link it to the fatha beforehand and say al, al. Secondly, we've got the letter ha. The letter ha, as we know, comes from the middle of the throat. It also has the characteristic of al-hams, the release of the breath. So we're going to actualize and be aware of that characteristic and strengthen it as much as possible and say al-ha, al-ha. The ha is connected to the meme. Al-ham, al-ham. Again, no qalqalah on the meme. We're not repeating or bouncing on that meme and saying al-ham. Next letter, we've got the letter dal. The letter dal has a dhamma on. So what do we want to do with every dhamma? We bring the lips forward to allow that sound to come through more naturally. And we have the word alhamdu, alhamdu, alhamdu. Okay. Move on to the next word. We've seen al-ism al-jalala, the second word here in the previous couple of verses. So kind of repeating what we said previously. The first lam has a kasra on. We want a complete kasra, bringing the bottom lip down and say li, lillah, going to the lengthening sound, which we said comes from al-jawf, the empty space within the mouth and the throat, elongated to 2 lengths because we've got that fatha and alif together, which allows it to become an elongated sound. So lillah, and then again the ha has a kasra on, complete kasra, bringing the lower lip down and saying lillahi, lillahi. Together with the first part, we've got alhamdulillahi, alhamdulillahi, alhamdulillahi. Okay, so that's the first phrase. Another potential mistake which you might hear or come across relates to the dhamma on the letter dal. The letter dal here only has a dhamma on, so it should only be elongated to 1 length. If it was going to be elongated to more than that, with a dhamma, the way that we elongate it is with the letter waw. So if you have a dhamma and a waw together, you go from u to u. And sometimes in the tune or in the way that this ayah is recited, you can have an elongation of this dhamma to make it from a single vowel to a harf mad, to an elongated sound, obviously, which is not correct because there's no waw here and there's just a single vowel. So what you would hear would be alhamdulillahi, alhamdulillahi, and you have this elongation of the dal, more than 1 vowel. It should only be 1 vowel, and what you should hear is alhamdulillahi, alhamdulillahi. So again, no elongation, no extra elongation of that vowel on the letter dal. There's no harf mad, so it should only remain as 1 length long. Okay. The letter ra on the word rabbi is a full ra. Again, coming from the tip of the tongue, we will go through exactly what is meant by fullness in a future lesson. But for now, we'll say it's a full letter connected to the ba. The ba has a kasra on. We want to again ensure that it's a complete kasra. The bottom of the lip is coming down and we're having that correct sound coming through. Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabbi. If you don't get a complete kasra sound, you have an eh sound coming in, like we had previously with Bismillahi. We have now Rabbi and not Rabbah, Rabbah, where you have an e sound coming through. The ba connects to the lam on the last word. Rabbil, Rabbil, Rabbil. It's difficult to put qalqalah onto the second lam here compared to the one that we saw right at the beginning. But again, just be aware, it's a lam. It's got a sakin on, but it's not one of the letters of qalqalah. So it shouldn't be Rabbil Alameen. There should be no echoing of that letter. And it should be completely closed. Rabbil. Okay. Then we go on to the letter Ain. Ain coming from the middle of the throat, same as the letter Ha in the first word. We've got a fatha, which takes it to one length, but we've also got this standing alif, as we mentioned last week. A standing alif and a fatha takes it to a harf mad, an elongated sound. So it's not just one length, but it goes to two lengths because we formed one of those lengthening sounds from al-jawf, as we said, the space within the mouth and the throat. So we have al-a, 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 elongated to two lengths. The last part, pretty simple. Lam with a single fatha on, la, mim with a ya after, ya sakina after. If we were reading through, it would be another example of a harf mad, elongated from one to two lengths. But because we're stopping on this ayah, we add a non-original sukoon onto that noon, and that kind of removes any harf mad, which we've talked about previously. And again, when we talk about stopping, we'll talk about exactly why that is. But for now, we know the phrase stops on al-alameen with a noon with a sukoon on to close off that ayah. So we have the word al-alameen, al-alameen. And again, with that last part, because we've got a kasra and a ya sakina, we're bringing the bottom lip down to allow that sound to come through. Okay. So we've been through the ayat now, and I hope that we can see that from when we first went through Al-istitiaalah, we were talking about very simple things. Al-basmala, we were talking about the origins a bit more. Now we've gone on to our third lesson. We're talking about origins, we're talking about characteristics, and we're starting to talk about different things like lengthening sounds and how different letters come together. So again, building on what we've talked about previously, and hopefully building on that further in the future. We'll just go through this ayah a few times as a group, and inshallah repeat after me where you are, and just keep in mind all the things that we've talked about today. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. الحمد لله رب العالمين. Perfect. So that is our practice done for today. Alhamdulillah, started onto the beginning of Surah Al-Fatiha, which we'll continue on to next week. Next week, as we said, we'll be going on to our next lesson of rules of An-Nun As-Sakina and Tanween. This does quite heavily build upon the weeks previous. So again, a request to go through all the content that we've been through already, just so that everything's making sense and we're not having to repeat things or leave anybody behind with any of the information. We hope you enjoyed today's lesson. All the videos will be online, inshallah, very soon for you to refer to. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to benefit us with what we've learned and to teach us what will benefit us and to increase us with in our iman and faith. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who recite the Quran as believers, who were described as the taste and the smell of it being good and pleasant and really enabling us to be connected to, who are described in the Quran as those as having a strong connection with the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala بالقول الثابت. اللهم طهر قلوبنا من النفاق وأعمالنا من الرياء وألسنتنا من الكذب وأعيننا من الخيانة فإنك تعلم خائنة الأعين وما تخفي الصدور. اللهم إنا نعوذ بك برضاك من سخطك وبمعافاتك من عقوبتك وبك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. سبحانك اللهم وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا for your du'as, and inshallah we'll see you at the same time next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.